Welcome to the Business of Family, the podcast where we explore the stories, challenges, and opportunities of family businesses. I'm your host, Tammy Buss, and I'm a family business survivor, and I'm also a family business advisor. In this show, we'll be talking with family business leaders and experts to bring you insights and inspiration so you too can survive your family business journey. Whether you're a founder, a successor, a professional, or just curious about family business, this podcast is for you. Our guest today is a business lawyer and intellectual property strategist based in Ontario who helps entrepreneurs and family businesses protect and profit from their brilliance. Her clients are often successful service providers who've built thriving businesses, only to find themselves trapped in delivery. Andrea Henry supports them in scaling without cloning themselves or losing control. Through her signature framework, Uncover Your IP Goldmine, and private legal strategy intensives, Andrea guides entrepreneurs in transforming their expertise into licensing models, certification programs, and other scalable assets, all while ensuring their content, contracts, and brand are legally protected. So if there's an intellectual property hiding in your business, Andrea knows how to uncover it, protect it, and turn it into a revenue stream that grows with the business, not because of the business. A recovering perfectionist and a mom of three, Andrea believes legal shouldn't feel like punishment. It should feel like power. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I'm looking forward to this too because IP, intellectual property, again, is one of those things is like, what? I don't really quite understand that. And I believe that we all have intellectual property. We
We
just don't
do.
really think of it as that. So, anyway, tell me a little bit about your work in that field.
So you've hit the nail exactly on the head. All of us have intellectual property. Intellectual property is defined as just any creation of the human mind. And if you've been in business longer than a nanosecond, you have created some intellectual property. The issue is we often undervalue it. So we've all met, maybe we've met a service provider who has an amazing onboarding system, or someone whose team, like the culture in their business is amazing because of how they train. But because it comes so naturally to them and they're using it only internally in their business, often they lose sight of how valuable that asset is. This is particularly important in family businesses or any business where you need to transition either to the next generation or to sale, because as you know, we need to increase the value of the business. And intellectual property assets, if they're properly protected, can add tremendous value to a business.
Absolutely. So, what sort of led you to specialize in intellectual property? Something must have happened along the way. It's always a reason. There's always a story, right?
Yeah. So my story is back in 2018, at the ripe old age of 37, I got stage 2 breast cancer. And at the time, I was just working all of the hours. So if you've met any lawyer, you know that, billable hours and working tons of hours is a badge of honor. And I remember waking up after surgery and asking for my laptop because I wanted to send an email to, it sounds entirely crazy now, but at the time I was like, well, this is just part of my life. And my surgeon came around the corner to check on me. And he looked at me quite rightly, like I was crazy. Like, you're not even in the, hospital room yet. You're in the surgical recovery bay. I think you can take a day off for your mastectomy. And I thought about it and I realized that it was crazy. And I realized that I needed to have something that could work without me, right? I loved my job. I loved my clients. And building a business that required me to send, to exchange time for money suddenly felt really precarious. So then I looked at the clients that I had worked with that I really loved working with, where I thought, look, these are people who have time to look after themselves. They're always at the forefront in terms of thought leadership because they have time to read and think. And they actually have time to enjoy their money. And there was a thread. I looked at my top 10 clients. All of them had significantly leveraged their intellectual property. And that may have looked like, I had clients who initially were providing consulting to corporations who had then created programs that they could license at scale. There were clients who had really strong brands who created certification programs, clients who created tools based on software, but it was all some leverage of intellectual property. And I thought, well, if I'm helping them to do it, I should start doing it myself. And so in 2020, I launched my first template site, which is a form of intellectual property. It was
Right.
some of the templates and the guides that I had used to train my team, and instead offered it to the public. And once I had that first hit of, oh my goodness, this thing can sell,
Mhm.
and I don't have to be in the room, I don't have a deliverable, it was like, and I became obsessed
Right.
with it. And then I really created this framework of, as we said at the beginning, most people don't even know they have it. So first we
No.
uncover what it is, and then we protect it, and then we can leverage it at scale.
So we have a family business. You go, yeah, that all sounds great, but how do you actually go in and start to, you know, find it, to dig for it?
Yes. So I would encourage everyone, and I can provide some resources to do your own intellectual property audit. And so this is everything that you have created in your business. So let's say it's a family business. Let's say it's a farm, right?
Yep.
And so you might not think of yourself as being really rich in intellectual property, but you may have a really strong brand. Maybe one of your kids does, has created the website, and now people come every summer to go pick strawberries. And you have, content that you've created around there. Maybe you have really strong training manuals for the influx of workers that you get, once or twice a year. That's all intellectual property. So what you're looking at is,
Interesting.
what have I created in my business to help my business grow, to help it, be more efficient, and to distinguish myself in the market. That's usually where the juiciest pieces of intellectual property are. And
Mm-hmm.
then once you've identified what they are, then you want to look at who has access to them. Is it just my family members? Is it employees? Do I know who has created these or not? It's really important when you're creating these assets, the same way how you wouldn't let everyone come into your house. You don't want to have everyone have access to intellectual property, at least not without, contractual terms in place.
Hmm.
And then the real magic comes in. Okay, this is how I'm using it now. How else could I use this? So again, I took my training materials, which I was using entirely internally,
Right.
and offered them to the public. So there's usually something that you're using within your business
Mm-hmm.
that can have other applications. So again, if we go back to the farm, maybe there are other farmers who would like to understand your training manuals, right? Who would like to not have
Right.
to start from scratch. Maybe there are people who are hobby farmers, but there's a particular aspect of what you do that is really applicable. So you're looking for that value. And whether you choose to use it, so if you're a farmer, you may not have any interest in selling your training manual. However, understanding the value of it
Mm-hmm.
becomes really important when you transition out of the business. Because if you're selling it, you want to make sure that that is included in your valuation. And if you're transitioning to the next generation, they may be a lot more interested in some of the different applications of what you've created.
Right. So when you talk about, say, selling your business, so we'll look at the succession, whether it's selling your business, and it could be to, as we talked about before, to employees, third party,
Yeah.
your family, or just a transition to your family. So you've defined that your intellectual property is your training manual, for example, because we'll use the strawberry farm. You have a strawberry farm. You've got a manual on how you bring people in, how you train them, how you do the berries, how part of it
Yeah.
is hand pick, whatever pick, and you got this whole thing done.
Yeah.
And so they've called you and they said, Andrea, is this intellectual property? And you've done your digging. You said, yes, this is intellectual property. So what happens? How do you protect that? Like what's the next step? So I've got this great manual that could be
Yeah.
changed for beans or corn or whatever it is. So
Exactly.
you've got the manual. What happens now?
So there are two main ways in which you can protect intellectual property. There's registrations that you can do, and there's also contracts. So when people think of intellectual property, often the first thought is trademark or copyright or patent. Those are registrations, right? So you register with the federal government, and they give you a piece of paper that says you own this thing. So those are
Right.
kind of the obvious ones. So if you had a name for your training manual and it was a particular program, you could trademark that. The content of the manual, you could register copyright. But what people often overlook is the power of contracts. Who's having access to it? So if you've got multiple people who are coming through your farm every season, making sure that your employment or your contractual agreements with them are really clear about how they can use the content and how they can't, right? If you are bringing on managers who are outside of the family in particular, again, understanding this is something that's an asset. You can only use it for the purpose of training our employees. This is not something that you can share or take back to another operation. And if you're interested then in leveraging it, it may be, hey, I'm going to allow you to use my manual, but under these conditions. So maybe it's not other strawberry farms because you don't want to, share it with competitors. Maybe it's a blueberry farm, right? Or a pumpkin farm in the fall. So you can have restrictions around how people use your content. And that is where contracts come in. Because registration actually just says, okay, you own it, but it's actually quite limiting. So for example, if you register for copyright, it just means no one can copy word for word. They can't take huge chunks of what you've created and reproduce it. But it doesn't stop people from being heavily inspired by you,
Right.
right? And
Right.
creating derivative works. But you can put those restrictions into contracts.
Oh, interesting. So when you have intellectual property, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to sell it, but you could sell it to a user.
You could sell it,
But
yeah.
you just keep it as either your secret sauce that you don't want to share. So if someone shares it, then there's an issue. So tell me a
Exactly.
little bit about
Yeah.
the registration part versus the contracting part. So
Yeah.
I've got because people will, make sure their name is,
Yeah.
registered and yada yada yada. So we've got this form. Let's say we've got this form we've created that we use with
Yeah.
family businesses. So we've created this form internally and we've got a copyright on it.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, it goes in binders or whatever. So what's the difference between that and then contracting if we're giving it to those clients? So now, we've every time we go out, there's 30 people who get a copy of this in their booklet that says copyrighted, but that's it. How does
Exactly.
that translate?
So in your client agreement, you would have a term that says, any of the materials that we share with you are for your personal use only. You're not allowed to create derivative works or any other works that would compete against us.
Mm.
That goes beyond the copyright, which just stops them from copying it.
Right. So that guarantees it. So it's not like similar to, like they just
Exactly.
changed a couple of words.
Exactly. And the real the crux of this is it's amazing if you want to leverage it. I love when people have created something and they see the opportunity to use it beyond the initial purpose. But even if that's not your intention, it's really important for business transition because especially if you're going to sell it or you need it needs to be valued because it's going to be passed on to an employee or a third party. If what you do can be easily duplicated because you've been completely loosey-goosey with your intellectual property, it is going to dramatically reduce the value of your business because why would I buy it from you when I could just do the same thing, right? I've got
Right.
all your manuals, I can do a similar brand, all of your secret sauce, I can just use because none of it's been protected. I just need to find an ex-employee and get them to implement what you've done. It makes it much less attractive to buy your business. Now, that depends. Sometimes people buy businesses mostly for customer lists or there's
Right.
like equipment or, that's not the case if the value of your business is in tangible assets, so inventory or equipment or property. But particularly for service-based businesses, a lot of it is going to be in the way that you do things, in your client list, in your brand, in your processes and your methodologies. And if you've got people who are using those and you haven't protected them, it makes it much less likely that someone's going to buy your business.
So what if you have your system, say your process on your website?
Mm, that's a great question. There is always a tension between we need to share, as business owners, we need to share enough for the public so that there's credibility, right? Very few people will come to work with you if they don't think that you know what you're doing. So you do need to showcase some of your process. The key is to be intentional. What is it that I'm okay sharing, and what needs to be behind a paywall? And you have to really think carefully about it. So I often suggest you share at a very high level. So you see, early in the conversation, I said my 3 steps are uncover, protect, and leverage. That's my framework. But I haven't given any details as to how
you're going to do that.
exactly.
Right.
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 And if I did, it would be very, very high level. So I often encourage people to think about, sometimes you do want to go viral. You want people to share. You might want to share, I often like this method. You share why you want to do it. You've got the case studies, the results of people working with you. And what you want people to come to you for is the transformation in the middle. And that's what you keep behind the paywall.
Interesting. Interesting. So, you deal with this every day. So what are a few most common, overlooked or misunderstood even IP in family businesses?
Yeah. So with family businesses in particular, there's not a ton of documentation and clarity.
Really?
As
Really?
soon as you can tell, right? So what happens is it's very loosey-goosey, and maybe dad started the brand, but now the daughter has really taken it on, and she's the one that's created the Instagram account, right? Or mom created the recipes, but someone else got sponsorship of an event involving the business. It's really important, especially among family, to be clear about who is creating what and who owns it. Ideally, for the purposes of succession and transition, everything is owned by the business, right? Whatever entity you're running it through, and not by the individuals. And what people don't often know is, unless you are an employee, there is a presumption that whatever is created, whatever intellectual property is created, belongs to the person creating it. So if you have hired independent contractors, or if you have family members who don't really actually have a status, maybe they're shareholders or partners, the presumption is that it belongs to them individually and not the company, unless a contract says otherwise. And I have seen situations where sales fell through because there was a creation of something and there was no documentation to show that the person who had created it had assigned their intellectual property rights to the entity. And now, the family was in disagreement, they wouldn't sign it over. And the person who's buying it is buying it because they want access, or at least partially, to that asset. If I can't assure myself that I'm going to have access to this, or if I'm going to have to pay somebody else besides you, all of a sudden your business looks a lot less attractive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So people, if I've hired you to create something for me, my assumption is it's mine.
Exactly.
But in
Whereas
theory, unless it says it in the contract,
it's mine.
it's yours.
Yeah.
Even though it's mine.
Even though you paid me to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. You must
It
come
is.
across that quite a bit.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I thought it was the other way around. So there you go. You learn something every day.
For employees, it is. For
Right.
employees, the presumption is that you're creating for the employer. But especially now, people use contractors, they're, family members who aren't officially anything. The presumption is going to be that that person, if they're not an employee, owns it.
Interesting. So then, how does that work if you're transitioning from one generation to the next?
Yes. So the ideal thing is to have the registrations in the name of the entity, the company, and anything that's been created, the contracts, the person who's created it has assigned all of the intellectual property rights to the entity. If that has not happened, one, you can have them assign the rights. But if that person says, actually, no, I want to retain rights to it, and you can't convince them otherwise, you may be able to negotiate a license, which is a license is basically, I own this intellectual property, but I will allow you to use it under certain terms. And that would be contractual. So let's say I was the daughter of the person who started the company, and I've created all of this great content and the website and the brand. And I'm like, actually, I want to own it. I'm not going to be involved in the transition. I want to make some money from the use of my intellectual property. I might license the use of it to the company via a contract. And then if the company gets sold, or if one of my siblings takes over, they can enforce that contract. They can continue to have access to the intellectual property.
So does it matter, I guess, when you said they're an employee? So if you have a child who is not fully employed by the company as an employee, but maybe just was hired to do this web page,
Yes,
is that considered their property then,
it
or the
is.
company? So it's unless
It is.
there is, so the definition of employee would be on payroll, being a
That's right.
regular paid, salaried,
Right. Yeah, you
hourly.
have to have an employee-employer relationship, which will mean you would need to pay salary. Even if it's a contract, then you would need to take out CPP and EI. Like it has to be an
Right.
actual employee.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, that's a really good, piece of information to file away, because there's
Very
so
nice.
many, because you're family members, you have people come in and help you.
Yeah,
Again, we talk a lot about, how to deal with family conflict and
yeah,
communication. And, if there's conflict and they've created something and you didn't realize it was theirs, I mean, there's another big case for, a
exactly.
separation or a problem within a family.
And
But
it happens. I had a case with two sisters who created this cafe. And one of the sisters had worked at a very large chain, and she created all of the operations manual, the training, etc. And then they got into a dispute. They hadn't put in place a shareholders agreement, which is where you can also address the issues of
right.
who owns what and what happens if you have a disagreement, but they didn't put it in place. And the other sister got fed up and left and just copied everything verbatim. So
That's
there's
interesting
nothing
because
saying that it.
it's interesting because, I've had that discussion with family members when it's, a child has been working in the business for a while and really doesn't know what the next ownership step is going to look like.
Yeah,
And they've said to me, Tammy, should I just open, next door and do the exact same thing? Like take the client list, like, because there's, like you say, there's not a lot of documentation when you're a family
no,
business, right? There's family, so you
that's
think you don't need it. But I
that's
just
the
want to
issue.
take a step back. Believe it or not, we're almost out of time, but I do want to chat a little bit about the different types of registrations. Tell me a little bit
Yes,
about the difference between them.
sure. So there are four different types of intellectual property, three of which can be registered. So trademark is anything that distinguishes you in the marketplace. So the obvious one is your name, but also a logo, a catchphrase, fragrance. I have a client who has a chain of salons who's trademarked a fragrance for her salons, colors. So the Home Depot orange is a trademark. It's basically anything, you see the Nike swoosh, anything that
Mhm.
people see or smell or interact with, and they attach it to your business. It has to be related to the business. So I don't know if you've seen, back in the days where people would go viral on social media and they would, maybe there's some type of catchphrase that they coin and it's really popular. You'll see if they're well advised, they'll start selling t-shirts or mugs with it on because they're not going to be able to get that trademark registration unless they can show there is a business element to what they're doing.
Mm, okay.
Otherwise, you can't protect it. So
Like,
that's
where's
trade.
the beef? That was the
Exactly.
where's the beef?
Exactly.
I don't even
Right.
know what commercial that was for. It's a hamburger chain, I think. I
I
can't
think it
even
was or the
remember.
beef farmers of America or something like that. I think, but it has to be. So sometimes people will go viral, but they can't protect it unless they have actually engaged in commerce in association with it.
Oh,
And
great.
people
Okay.
lose things all the time because they didn't know that, and then another company will swoop in. The second type is copyright. So copyright does what it says on the tin. It is the right to copy. So this is for artistic, dramatic, literary, or musical works. And literary is a very, like, this does not need to be, the next Margaret Atwood. Even computer code counts as literary for copyright purposes. And it essentially says if you have the copyright, if you registered copyright in one of those formats, then you're the only person that has the right to copy it and distribute it. That would be useful, let's say, if you're a family business, but as a side thing, you've created a course on how to run a strawberry farm. The content of that course can be registered copyright, and you protect how people, interact with it and copy it. And then the third registration is patents. So patents are for engineering innovations or new technologies. So you'll see it for drugs. You'll see it for, if you were to create a new combine or a new, way to harvest, that would be subject to patent.
Okay, interesting. And when you patent or you use any of those, is it
Mm-hmm.
per province or state or country,
Per
or like
country.
how does that work? Per
So it's per
country?
country. Unfortunately, that's why intellectual property protection can start to get costly because it
Mhm.
is per country. So if you're in Canada and you want to, like, say you've got a name or a logo that you want to protect, you would first register in Canada because that's where your entity is. And then you can apply to extend the registration in other countries, but then you'll pay additional filing fees. Canada is a member of something called the Madrid Treaty. So our major trading partners, including the US, EU, UK, are all members of this treaty. You can apply in Canada, and if you apply in one of the member countries within 6 months of applying in Canada for trademark and copyright, they will treat the application as if you had done it at the same time in that country. So we're June 10th. If you apply today, you would have until, where are we, December 10th to register in the US, for example, and they would treat it as if you had applied on June 10th.
Okay,
So that's something
interesting.
to bear in mind if you've got, if you sell outside of Canada.
Interesting. Well, I can't believe we're out of time. I find this so fascinating. There's so much more to dig into, but we do try to keep it very short, so it's
Yeah.
like a nice commute podcast. But we do like to close off every podcast with advice or tips. So I'd like your top 3 pieces of advice when it comes to safeguarding what a family has built.
Okay. So the first one, document, document, document. I know family businesses don't love to do it, but that really is going to create so much clarity. So document everything. 2, if you are creating intellectual property, you want to register and assign the intellectual property to the business entity as opposed to the individuals. And the third, I'm sure you will be shaking your head in agreement, plan for succession early. Right? If you've got, really, for any family business, but particularly for an intellectual property heavy business, you want to think really early, how is this going to be valued? Who needs to be involved? Do we have everything registered? You want to plan long before you actually need to call on those resources and those registrations.
That's amazing. So, Andrea, where could people reach out to you, or your webpage where they could find more information on this? Because this
Yeah.
is fascinating, and I'm sure it's got people thinking.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I find it very fascinating. So always glad to so I'm andreahenry.ca, so fairly easy to find. I also tend to hang out a lot on LinkedIn. So Andrea Henry, if you Google me, Andrea Henry Lawyer, I'll pop up in all kinds of places. But my website is andreahenry.ca.
Excellent. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
If you like this episode, subscribe to the Business of Family podcast on your favorite listening platform. You can also find Blue Roots on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. On the next show, I'll be back with another amazing guest who will inspire you with their family business insights. Until then, take care and keep it in the family. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, tax, investment, or insurance advice. Before acting on any advice, please contact your personal or company advisors.